Imbromant të nderuara zonja dhe zotrinj. Kemi parë shpesh herë politikanë të akuzojnë, të fyejnë njëri tjetrin dhe më pas të thonë që janë shpifje për fakte apo ngjarje që kur shkojnë në gjykat, në momentin kur pala akuzuese është në opozit i humbet gjyqet, më pas kur vjen në pushtet i fiton gjyqet. Ka shumë momente kur nuk kuptohet se ku është vija ndarse midis jetës private dhe jetës publike, po flasim për shpifjen dhe ligjin e të drejtës së informimit. Kam një të ftuar special sot me famë botërore, ja cili është ai?
Gavin Miller, jurist me famë botërore, në 2012 është renditur si një nga 100 njerëzit më influent në median britanike dhe Guardian. Ka mbrojtur disa çështje të bujshme, mes tyre edhe ish bashkëpunëtorin e CIA-s, Edward Snowden. Ka studiuar drejtësinë në Oxford dhe është i specializuar për shpifjen, privatësinë, ankimime apo kufizime. Ekspert i Këshillit të Europës për çështjet e lirisë së shtypit dhe drejtuesi i qendrës për gazetarinë investigative. Edhe pse i angazhuar në Europën Lindore dhe në Ballkan prej vitesh, vjen në Shqipëri për herë të parë.
Gavin Miller, welcome in my show.
Thank you for having me.
I was reading some reviews about you, and you were a really big gun at the top of your game amongst the most influential media people in the UK. It's going to be a hard time for me to interview you.
If you ask me the right questions, I'm sure you'll get the right answers.
Let me start with your first visit in Albania.
This is my first visit in Albania, and so far I've only been in Tirana, as I'm very disappointed about that. I want to go to the coast, so I shall be coming back to get a chance to go to the coast next time.
When is the next time then?
Well, hopefully in the spring, summer, in a few months' time.
Beautiful. And the conference you held about standards on defamation, organized by Council of Europe in Tirana. How did you find that? Interesting?
It was very interesting. Every different legal system in Europe is interesting to somebody like me because everybody has a slightly different approach to the media and media law and defamation. And it's always interesting to hear what the problems are in different countries.
Did you get a flavor of the problems in Albania?
Yes, I did get a flavor of the problems in Albania, but they're not unfamiliar problems.
Meaning that you have the same problems in the UK or other EU countries?
We have the same problem with defamation all over Europe. People always want to take action to protect their reputation against other people, against the media, when they feel they've been unfairly attacked. And the law has to find some fair way of mediating the interests involved in that situation.
Let me ask you a straightforward question because I want my viewers to have a better idea what we're talking tonight, because it's quite complicated as a topic. What is defamation?
Defamation is any statement that's made, usually printed words, but it can be spoken words like we're doing now, that involves an attack on the reputation or the character of another person. And these are words that are heard by other people, maybe the reader of a newspaper or a viewer of a television program. And the consequence is that they think less of the person who's been attacked through those words. The reputation of that person has been damaged, and they want some sort of redress, or they want the court to say it wasn't true.
So is defamation usually made by chance, let's say, or they have purposes when they do a defamation? Whoever does it, the media or politicians? Or that's the judge to decide?
Defamation is the damage that is done by the words to the person's character. It really doesn't matter, in most cases, why the person has said those unpleasant things. And people say them for all kinds of reasons, good and bad reasons.
Okay, I will give you some Albanian cases, examples, because I want your perspective and your experience to explain it. And we are a young democracy, only 24 years almost, and media is young as well, and we're trying to build some standards as well. But it's not easy always. When a politician in Albania, and we have had plenty in the last years, they say to the opponent, you have raped a girl who had AIDS. You became vice minister by stealing the paintings. You have killed people and you have stolen millions. you got 10 million company, this and that. What should the media do when the politicians, and I'm talking about former vice prime ministers or the current prime minister saying these words?
Well, that sort of attack by a politician is part of the political discourse. It may be tasteless, it may be that people don't like it, and it may be that people would rather their politicians, conducted themselves more courteously than that. But because it's part of the political discourse in a democracy, it's important for the media to cover it in some way, to cover the fact that a politician is attacking another politician in that way. The problem for the media is to cover it without making themselves liable for the same accusation that one politician is making against another. And that's a matter of journalistic technique. It is possible for the media to report that politician A has attacked politician B, even in these strong terms, using this strong language, without the journalist saying, but this is, and I'm adopting this statement, this is my view. It's simply presented to you as the reader or the viewer as a fact that the politician has said that. And the danger for the journalist is when you take sides in that situation and you appear to the viewer or the reader to be supporting the attack by one politician, the truth of the attack by one politician on the other one.
So even though the journalist knows that these are just political accusations, they have no real ground, there are no facts, they should report on it?
That's a matter of ethics for the journalist. The journalist has to assess what the public interest is in any particular piece of reporting. But let's just take it at its simplest. If the political discourse, the political discussion in a democracy is being conducted at a very low level, lower than it should be, without real thought, on a personal basis, the people should know that that's how their politicians are behaving. The press should find a way of telling them how their politicians are behaving so they can decide whether they approve of it or disapprove of it.
So it's left to people to decide?
Always. The role of the press is to pass on the information and the ideas to the public about what's going on in society, particularly in political debate, so that the people can make their own judgments.
Let me ask you again, stress another question in this area. We have politicians that when they are in opposition, let's say an MP from the opposition, and they made an accusation or they say something, they are accused of defamation, and they lose every case in the courts in Albania when they are in the opposition. For the same accusations, when they are part of the majority of the government, they win every case. For the same accusations, the same facts. What can we do with that in this case?
Well, look, any defamation case should be decided on the facts of the case and on the merits, applying the law within the European principles that we were discussing at our seminar. And a judge should decide the case, applying that law to the facts, fairly, independently, without bias. If you have a system where judges tend to find for those who are in power, if I can put it that way, there may be a problem with the independence of the judiciary.
Actually, we have, according to some reports and surveys, the high corruption in the judiciary system in Albania. So maybe that doesn't help in terms of defamation and how to get the facts straight?
No, not at all. It doesn't help, and it's particularly problematic when the claimant and the defendant are both politicians, because the judge gets pulled by the political winds that are blowing in the country one way or the other, and that's wrong.
You made a distinction between fact and opinion. Can we explain it to our viewers? How can this distinction be made? Can we give an example? What is a fact and what is an opinion?
Well, if I say that you stole 1,000 euros, that's a statement of fact. If I say you're beautiful, that's a statement of opinion. It's not a defamatory statement of opinion. If I say you're an idiot, that's a defamatory statement of an opinion. Now, the importance of that distinction is that the speech is protected differently in European law according to whether it's fact or opinion.
When you say that that's a fact that you have stolen 10,000 euros, how can you prove that? You need proofs, facts? What should a journalist do?
What the journalist should do, there are two possibilities. One, you can try and prove as a matter of fact that that happened. You can be, if you like a policeman or a prosecutor when the case comes to court, and try and prove the truth of the allegation.
With more than one source?
With more than one source if you have them, whatever material you have. But that's often very difficult to do because journalists are not police officers, and they're not prosecutors. And very often sources won't come forward and speak in court. Very often you can't get access to documents and so on and so forth. So it is possible for a journalist to defend that sort of allegation by persuading the judge, this is the European law, that the allegation made was on a matter of public interest and that they behaved responsibly as a professional journalist in the way they investigated and presented the story to the public.
How does the judge decide on a case by giving a meaning to the words? This
is very difficult because no two people ever agree about the meaning of the same set of words. If you and I looked at the same set of words, we would find a different meaning within it. The European Court of Human Rights, which reviews decisions in countries in the Council of Europe, very often says that the judge in the domestic court has taken an unrealistic view of what the words mean. So you have to take a realistic view of what the words mean. You have to look at the essence or the thrust of the article and decide, and the headline and all the material that surrounds it, and decide what the article is really saying to the reader, to a reasonable reader. Not an unreasonable reader, but somebody who would read it in a reasonable way.
Yes, and the main reason of the defamation is to lower somebody's reputation. How can that be measured by the judge? The reputation was lowered or was damaged?
Well, you can look first of all at the standing of that person in the community before the defamation took effect, before it was published. You can look at how serious the allegation is. Some allegations are more serious than others. If I call you a murderer or a terrorist, it's a very serious allegation. You can look at how many people read or heard the allegation. And you can look at any evidence about any particular damage done to that unique reputation that we each have. If I'm a priest or a doctor, I need a professional reputation to persuade people that I'm a good and reliable and honest priest or a doctor. So how has the defamation damaged the person in that area of their life? And there are guidelines available in most legal systems for the amounts of money that are acceptable amounts of money to award in damages, for example, for different types of defamation.
So is it difficult to find a price, to put a price for the reputation?
It is very difficult, and you have to be practical about it. We had in the UK, 20 years ago, we had juries awarding damages in defamation claims. I know you don't have juries here, it's a very Anglo-American thing. But in some cases, they were awarding £1 million to celebrities like Elton John and very famous people in the news. And the courts simply had to say in the end, that's too much. It's too damaging to freedom of speech to make newspapers pay those sorts of damages. And the higher courts laid down a scale of damages. What is the highest amount of damages you could get? So in England, it's about 250,000 euros is absolutely the highest you could get in damages. But of course, damages are referable to the value of money in a society. So I tend to look at them as how many years' average earnings are the damages.
Where does the interference with the free speech start and where it ends in the case of a defamation?
Well, it starts with the journalist sitting, thinking about writing the article and saying to himself or herself, I won't make this allegation, I won't write this article, because I'm afraid that if I do that, I will get sued in defamation and it will cost me money, or I'll be prosecuted, or whatever.
Or I may lose the job.
Or I may lose the job, yeah. We call that the chilling effect. And a great many stories that are good stories, that should be published, get put to one side because journalists are worried about the threat of defamation. That's where it starts. Where it ends, of course, is the journalist who's published the story and gets taken to court and finds themselves being found liable, and maybe in a criminal court fined or in a civil court facing a large award of damages. And that's a big threat. That's a big threat. And very often journalists can be bankrupted by defamation actions.
Have you had cases in the UK when a politician was found guilty on a defamation?
Where a politician was found guilty of a defamation. We have a very different political cultural situation in the UK. Politicians try to stay out of defamation cases for the most part. They may occasionally bring claims against newspapers, but they don't bring claims against each other. They're very reluctant to do that because the public in the UK thinks that the best way for two politicians to sort out their differences
so they don't often call each other murderers.
Is in public debate. It's not in a courtroom.
It's not often for the UK cases that they call each other murder and
politicians?
Yeah.
No, they don't. No, they don't sue each other.
Have you ever heard that in the UK?
No, never.
No. Okay, it's a daily routine here.
Oh, really?
Yes. But
and what does the public think about that?
They still vote when the time comes. But of course they don't have a high opinion, I suppose and I guess, but I cannot talk for my public because we don't have proper surveys and I cannot go into details. But let me stay again in UK because I want to ask you, what did the media world learn from the phone hacking scandal, the Murdoch case?
Well, I think it learned that there is an area of unlawful and unethical practice that journalists can stray into. That can get them into a lot of trouble. That the public will react very badly to it, the politicians will react very badly to it if they're found out. And as you know, journalists are being prosecuted in the criminal courts now for phone hacking.
Yep, I know.
So they have to learn a lesson from it, which is that there are boundaries to how journalists can behave.
But what the journalists were publishing, they were true, because of the taping and the hacking of the phones.
That's true.
Is there another problem?
That's true, but news gathering, how you gather the information, has its own set of rules and regulations surrounding it. It's not just about what you publish and whether it's true, it's whether you gather it in the right fashion, in the right way, whether it's legal, ethical, and responsible. And I'm afraid phone hacking failed on all three of those counts. And there are consequences for journalists where they misbehave like that.
The closing down of the news of the world, I think we have the cover. Thank you and goodbye. Is it a lesson for the media in the UK? Are they using that as a lesson?
I think it is a lesson for the media, but I think they have bigger problems than closing down the newspaper, because the newspaper reopened as the Sun on Sunday, in effect, as a seventh-day Sun. So the title has gone, it's a very famous and old title, but they continue to put out the content in a different form. I think the lessons that have been learned is that you can be prosecuted as a journalist in England for improper, illegal behaviour, and they now face the threat of much stricter regulation in England and the UK.
By the regulator,
Well, there's a big contest going on at the moment. There is a regulator set up by the industry, a new regulator, which is much tougher than the Press Complaints Commission, which was the regulator that failed to stop phone hacking. But the government has also proposed structure for a more formal regulator. And it may be that will come into play. But the newspapers don't want to sign up to the government's regulator. They want to self-regulate through their own organisation.
I'll come back to the scandal, Murdoch, phone hacking scandal. Do the governments put pressure on the press, on the media, to kill a story or to shut down a story?
I think sometimes they try to, but there's very little chance of succeeding in the UK. We had a judge-led inquiry by Lord Justice Leveson after the phone hacking inquiry. And one phase of the inquiry looked at the relationship between politicians and journalists. And it can be a very close relationship. It can be a mutually beneficial relationship. The journalist gets a story from the politician gets to put their case to the journalist. But I think most British journalists would think it was quite improper for a politician to try and put pressure on them to run a particular story or run it in a particular way. It would probably only make things worse for the politician if they tried that.
So it's not the case that a government official can call a journalist and say, don't publish this because I'll shut down your paper? Because in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, it may happen. It has happened.
No, they can't do that. But as you may know, in the summer of last year, I was advising the Guardian newspaper about its coverage of the Edward Snowden revelations. And that was a rare example of where the government intervened with the editor of the newspaper to try and prevent the newspaper publishing something. Not to close the newspaper down, but to prevent it publishing something.
Okay, I'll come back to that story, but let me go back to the story on News of the World and the Murdoch phone hacking case. Rebecca Brooks, that is still being investigated for the phone hacking, I have read revelations in the press of papers of court papers about an affair she had, 6-year affair with Andy Coulson, the former spin doctor of Cameroon. Isn't this a case of breach of her privacy? She is being investigated for the phone hacking. How about her private life in this case?
Well,
is it being damaged because of this revelation? She's denying the affair.
She's not denying the affair.
She said yesterday, I was reading that she denies the affair of 6 years, but she says we had physical contact during the years.
Yes, exactly. She's giving evidence about it at the moment.
Is this a breach of privacy in this case?
In a courtroom, in a prosecution, very often, as you will know, a piece of evidence has to be put forward by the prosecution or by the defence, which intrudes into somebody's private life. And the reason it has to be put forward is because it's relevant to the prosecution or the defence. It has something to do with the issues in the case. It's not gratuitous. And in this case, the prosecution felt that they needed to prove a close relationship between Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson as her successor as the editor of the newspaper. And this was the way they chose to try and prove it. Whether what the jury will think about it, we will see when they give their verdict.
So it was right by the media to report on it, on this relationship?
Oh, sure. In the UK, anything that happens in open court can be reported on by the media, provided you report it fairly and accurately. We have a strong tradition of open justice, so there are very few situations in which the media can be prevented from reporting something that happens or is said in a court case. How
lawful, and then what are the ethical borders that you think on use of unorthodox methods as private detectives or buying of documents by the media or hidden cameras? How lawful are they?
If there is a sufficient public interest in the story that's going to be published, it's possible to justify deception, payments, hidden cameras, hidden tape recorders. All of those things are possible, but there has to be a strong public interest. And the journalist has to know when they decide to use one of those techniques that they are pursuing a strong public interest. You see, many would say that to publish state secrets, like The Guardian did, is quite improper, because they've been stolen by Edward Snowden. They've been stolen by the source, and you shouldn't touch them, and you shouldn't publish them. But a judgment has to be made by the journalist and the editor whether the story is so important to the public and as a matter of public interest that handling that material, investigating, gathering the news in that way, can be justified in that instance.
How do you measure the importance that has for the public interest? How do you make the judgment as a journalist?
Well, that's It's often very difficult. I mean, it's not difficult to say that some things have a high public interest, and we know what they are. So if a politician is corrupt, an elected politician is corrupt, that's a matter of high public interest. If there is an environmental disaster occurring and being covered up, that's a matter of public interest. If there's malpractice in the professions, let's say in the health profession or in the legal profession, corruption amongst judges, I mean, all those things people would say obviously are matters of public interest. Where it gets difficult is where it's less clear what's in the public interest. So we've had many debates over the last 10 years about stories about the private life of politicians and celebrities. Is it in the public interest for the public to know that somebody is cheating on his wife, for example, if he's a politician or he's an England footballer or he's a pop star or an actor?
Is it? What do you think as a lawyer?
Well, as a lawyer, it depends on the facts of the case. So I did a case 2 years ago for a tabloid newspaper in London who had revealed facts about Rio Ferdinand, who was then the England football captain, and a relationship he'd had that he had not told his wife about. And in the end, we won the case on the basis that there was a public interest in the story because Ferdinand, when he became England captain, had for a number of years, in books, in newspapers, in interviews, said,
The family man.
I'm a faithful family man. And he was therefore misleading the public. And he was now assuming a role where he was a role model to many young men and women as the captain of the England football team. And so the judge said, well, there is some public interest in this. It might not be so with another footballer, but with this footballer it is, on these facts.
How is the practice in the UK? The paper, the media, goes into the judge before it publishes the news when they have a story?
No.
They go after?
Yes. We have a rule called publish and be damned in England, which means if you're going to publish a defamatory story, the claimant, the complainant, even if they find out about it, can't get a pre-publication order to stop you publishing it. They can do with private material. If you're going to publish stuff about somebody's private life, you can get a pre-publication order, but you have to know about it. And very often they don't know about it in order to get the order. And we had a very famous case of a man called Max Mosley, who was the subject of a story in one of the tabloid newspapers about his sex life a few years ago. And he was not notified in advance they were going to run this story. And he brought a case and took a case all the way to Strasbourg. And he said to the European Court of Human Rights, the journalist must tell somebody like me if they're going to publish information about my private life so that I can go to the judge first and ask for an order to stop them doing it. And the Strasbourg court said, no, there is no obligation on the newspaper to warn the subject of the story that private information is going to be published.
But what's the point going after in the court? To stop republishing it if you win the case?
Yes,
always.
That's one of the things you can do, and you can get damages as well.
Okay, and what are some of the abuses under the justification of public interest in the UK or in your experience?
Well, that was one of the cases. The Max Mosley case was one of those. One of the most glaring cases, one of the worst cases. He was having sex parties, and the newspaper paid one of the prostitutes who was attending the party to have a hidden camera on her, and they filmed the sex party, and they published a story. In the course of the sex party, it was alleged by the newspaper that Max Mosley was, and the girls were wearing Nazi uniforms, or what looked like Nazi uniforms. And his father had been a fascist in the 1930s, a very famous fascist in Britain. And he himself was the head of the International Motoring Organization. And so the newspaper said it's in the public interest to show film of this happening because the public needs to know that this is what this man does. And the judge said, absolutely not. There is no public interest in knowing that level of detail about somebody's sex party.
Interesting. I have to go into a commercial break and we're coming back in a short while. Jemi rikthyer në pjesën e dytë të intervistës me Gavin Miller, është një jurist me famë botërore që ka mbuluar çështjet e lirisë së shtypit por dhe të shpifjes. Po flasim për eksperiencën e tij në Britaninë e Madhe por edhe në vende të tjera të Europës. Mr. Miller, we have had a famous case in Albania with a former Minister of Culture who was filmed during an evening in his apartment by a hidden camera. You're seeing the pictures there. From a journalist that pretended to be an interviewee who was applying for a job. And it turned out that was a hidden camera to prove that he was using his power as a minister in order to have, let's say, intimate relationship with the journalist in this case. The court, the first court the court here, the first degree in Tirana, found guilty the TV channel that broadcasted it, and they decided on 400,000 euros damage for the former minister. And then in the second case, the Court of Appeal overthrew that decision, and the High Court decided to have another, to bring the case in the first degree court again, to be investigated from the beginning. In this case, the biggest debate in Albania has been, was the TV show, the journalist, right to go in his apartment one evening and pretend she was interviewed for a job, and was his privacy breached by the cameras, the journalist?
Well, the question of whether the journalist was justified in going in and doing that is a question of journalistic ethics. Normally we would say that if there is material, if there is information in the possession of the journalists that suggests that the politician is going to behave like this if she does it, and it would be a matter of public interest to know that he's going to behave like that, that can justify using deception and using the hidden camera. What you're not allowed to do is try something like this without having any information in advance that the politician might behave in this way. We call it fishing. You know, you throw the line into the river and hope to pull up a fish. You have to know and have some information to suggest there may be some fish swimming around down there before you use these deceptive techniques. His privacy is undoubtedly invaded because it's his home, and it's what he thinks is a private conversation between two people. But privacy is not absolute, particularly for politicians. You can lawfully invade a person's privacy if, again, there is a sufficient public interest. Now, it's not for me to judge the public interest in this story because I don't know the whole context, but many people might think it's a misuse of a politician's power and influence, an abuse of that power and influence, to use that power and influence to get involved with a young woman like this.
Do you, in this case, if it was in the UK, who would have won the case?
The judge would look very closely at the facts. The judge would look very closely at what the journalist knew before they went into the room, and very closely at what the politician said, and would decide whether there was a sufficient public interest in what was broadcast and published about what the politician said. Now, I don't know exactly what the politician said, but if the politician propositioned the journalist, for example, in a way that suggested he was using his position and his influence as an elected politician, I would have thought there would be a very strong case for the journalist.
For the same case, actually, Mr. Pango, the former minister, filed into a France court in France because French 24 broadcasted some part of the videos, and he won the case, but the judge decided that his reputation was damaged, and he was fined, the TV channel was fined only for €1. Their explanation was due to the territorial restrictions, and no one knows him in France, so there was no real damages there. How would you comment that?
Well, France has quite strict privacy laws. It always has had. But it has very low levels of damages, awards and fines, as you've seen from that case. I know some, so it doesn't surprise me is the answer. I know some glossy magazines in France where the editors, before they publish the magazine, go through them and go through the photographs, like the photograph of Mr. Mitterrand coming out of his lover's flat, which was published a few months ago.
Mr. Holland, yeah.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Mitterrand, you are not wrong, because he had an affair,
yes,
and a daughter as well.
Mr. Holland will go through the edition, and they will say, that's 2,000 euros, that's 3,000 euros, that's 5,000 euros, and they will calculate how much it's going to cost them to publish that edition of the magazine, and then they go ahead and publish. And I suspect a lot of editors and journalists do that in Europe these days, because there isn't a lot of money involved in it, and people like to read these stories.
But was it a breach of privacy of Mr. Holland's private life to publish that story?
I personally don't think it was. But I have a very broad view of what the public interest is. And I think that in the US, for example, if you are a public figure, which he is, par excellence, then you have to accept this stuff. In Europe, we're more cautious about it. We don't...
especially in France.
Especially in France.
People seem disinterested to know about it.
Exactly. Although it's changing quite a lot in France. I think they're becoming less obsessed with privacy. And maybe in England, we're becoming more obsessed with privacy for public figures. But I think that's the key with Hollande. I think he is a classic public figure. And I think he must accept that he can't keep this sort of area of his private life private, especially when the French public is paying for a first lady to reside in the Élysée, Paris, and fulfill functions of the first lady.
So in this regard, that is the public interest for this story?
I would say so. If you took a narrower view of the public interest, you would say no, there is no public interest. But my job as a lawyer is to construct public interest arguments for the newspapers in this situation. And it seems to me that is, if he didn't have a partner in the Élysée, Paris, if he was a single man, it would be a different thing. But I think in the position that he's put himself in, the public is entitled to know that he's doing this.
What was the public interest to publish Kate Middleton topless pictures when she was in vacation with her husband?
I don't think there was a public interest in that, and the British papers took a long look at those photographs and decided not to publish them. It took European magazines to publish them.
So that shows the cultural problems or the ethic problems from one country to another one as well?
I think that what's happening at the moment, and these things go in phases, is that the pendulum, do you understand that word, is swinging in favour of privacy a bit in England. In the 1990s and the 2000s, you could invade people's privacy very easily. And we saw with Princess Diana what the tabloid press in the UK did to her private life. They trashed her private life, and people felt it was wrong. So there's been a backlash against that in England. In Europe, on the other hand, in France and Germany, they have had very restrictive privacy laws surrounding their public figures and celebrities for a very long time. And there things are moving the other way a bit, and they're opening up a bit. Things will change as time moves on. People's attitude changes. But,
and according to you, they're going towards protecting privacy or letting it more public?
In Europe, much more public. I mean, I don't think, I will say quite clearly, there is no public interest in publishing the topless photograph of Kate Middleton. And people have tried to construct public interest arguments. So they say, well, supposing the photographer with the long lens camera was a terrorist with a gun. He had a clear view on her. He could have shot her. What's her security like? It's no good at all. But the point is, you can tell that story to the public if you want without publishing the photograph.
The fantasies can go on and build up some stories.
Exactly. They're just selling magazines, basically.
Mr. Miller, is it ethical and lawful for the media to take information from private investigators and build up a story and publish it through its channels?
It depends what the private investigator does, is the answer. Journalists do use private investigators. Of course, they use private investigators to phone hack, which was quite wrong. But there are some types of investigations which are lawful, which a journalist is perfectly entitled to pay a private investigator to conduct, just as lawyers and banks and big businesses use private investigators, just as couples who are divorcing use private investigators. But most journalists would think that it's their job to do the investigation and to do the research, and that if you need to pay a private investigator to do it, well, you're not really a very good journalist. So it should happen only very rarely, I think. And again, there has to be a public interest. There has to be a clear public interest in it.
But let's take another example, another case, when a politician gives you certain files and informations that you may use because the politician wants to attack his opponents, and there may be true facts in that. What shall a journalist do? Again, going back to the ethical and standards, or just publish it? Because it has public interest in this case.
Sure. Well, don't just publish it. Take it as a piece of source material, which could be the basis for an article and a story. Evaluate it, consider what the public interest story is, take the material out of it that's important, that's not confidential or private, that has a justification that makes it worth publishing. And then go to the person affected by the story, go to the other politician, or go to the government, or go to whoever it is, and get their comment on it. Tell them you've got it. Get their comment on it. And write in the end, after you've finished your investigation, a balanced piece of journalism that tells the reader what is in the source material and what the response of those affected by it is.
But doesn't the journalist, the reporter in this case, has the risk that the politician who will know about this file, they will try to stop the publishing of the piece and use media owners and use the fragile media environment to stop the story?
That is a risk. If it's confidential and private information or it's defamatory and the system allows pre-publication orders to be obtained, that is a big risk. And sometimes one has to say to a newspaper, and I've said it myself, you have to just publish this. You just have to publish it in its raw form, as it is, to get the story started, to get the story rolling, and then take the consequences, because it is so likely that you will get a pre-publication order against you that you'll never be able to publish unless you just get it out there now.
What are the borders of entering into the private life, into sexual life, medical life? Is it a border or is it too blurry to be drawn?
There isn't an absolute border. Every case is a question, involves questions to be decided on its own facts. But there are some areas of private life that are at the very center or the very core of private life. Medical details, sexual activity, relationships with children, family, that sort of thing. We can all immediately recognize those as intimately private details. And therefore, there has to be a very strong public interest ever to publish anything like that. And very often you can publish something about that, something about the story, without publishing the most intimate detail, or maybe without publishing a photograph or a detailed account of what is happening. So there's a balance to be struck in all these sorts of cases. But it's very rare that there would be a public interest, for example, in publishing information about a health problem. I mean, of course, coming back to Mitterrand, that was a big issue in Mitterrand's life, that he suffered from illnesses that weren't disclosed to the French public when he was the president of the country. And there's a big, perhaps, difference between the French tradition and the Anglo-American tradition there as to whether the public are entitled to know about the health problems of the Prime Minister or the President.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the media is driven by the public interest, or more often they just want to sell papers and they write articles about public person that they think they will sell more?
Well, I think it differs from newspapers, from media outlet to media outlet. I mean, we are very fortunate, I have to say, in the UK in having the BBC, for example, which is a huge media outlet and puts out a vast amount of content on radio, on television, on a website, so on and so forth, which is very careful about making sure that it sticks to what is in the public interest. At the other end of the spectrum, we have tabloid newspapers that are quite openly interested in selling as many copies as they can do, and maybe are not as concerned about the public interest, but they see the role of journalism as to entertain rather than to inform.
Yeah.
And for my part, I think we're very fortunate in Britain to have all these different, and in the middle, obviously, there are different types of newspapers and publications. But what The Guardian would publish, or the BBC would publish,
is different from what The Sun will publish.
Or the Express would publish.
You advise media organizations. What do you advise them usually?
Well, I either advise them how to avoid getting into a court case, or I advise them how to get out of a court case, or I go into court and do the court case for them if I can't sort it out. But
I mean, what are the most issues, the cases that you often advise them that they have problems with defamation?
I explained earlier on that it is possible to publish allegations of fact responsibly and in a balanced way. And newspapers know ultimately that if they want to defend their journalism on that basis, it is a judge rather than an editor who will decide whether they've behaved responsibly. So what happens in the UK quite a lot is they come to a lawyer like me before they publish. Mm-hmm. And they tell the lawyer everything that's gone on in the investigation in the newsroom. They show me all the material they have. They show me a draft of the article. And they say, if we run this, will the judge uphold our defence of responsible journalism on a matter of public interest? Mm-hmm. And I have to act as the judge and tell them how they might change it.
To go ahead or... Yeah.
Do some more research, that's my role.
Is it a tough job?
It can be a tough job, particularly when you're taking a decision like an article that may bring a legal case on them. Yeah, because if you say it's fine, publish it, and they end up losing the legal case, you look very silly. But these are judgments we have to make. That's what we get paid for.
And you advised The Guardian on regards of Edward Snowden's story. Was it right to publish the secret information that he disclosed?
I think it was right for them to publish what they did publish. You need to understand they published a tiny sub-percentage of the material that he took. Tiny, tiny amount of it. And they were very careful in extracting from the information the material that wouldn't obviously harm national security and that was of a real public interest, so the public could know how wide the powers were of the security services, both the NSA in America and GCHQ in the UK, and how easy it had become for them to get our digital information, the information that we live on and feed off every day of our life, and to know so much about us. It's ultimately for the politicians and for the government and for the people to decide whether those powers should exist and whether they should be exercised in that way. But to not know, for the people not to know this is going on, is wrong. So I would say it was a very clear case of a high public interest.
But was the reputation of the United States government in this case damaged because of the information that were disclosed? They were taping Angela Merkel and other EU leaders?
Yes, but we don't worry about the reputations of government. Governments don't have reputations in defamation. The issue in a case like the Snowden case is this is a state secret. Mm-hmm. And will the publication of that state secret do damage to the national interest, to national security? That's the issue. It's a slightly different issue. Mm-hmm. And it's a very difficult one to assess very often. So the journalist has to try and make sure that what is published tells the public interest story to the public without damaging national security.
According to your view, has the freedom of speech changed after WikiLeaks, the publication of Assange and what Snowden as well published, in a way that media and journalists do not control the information anymore? There are other sources how the information can be published.
Yes, I think so. I think, but whether the sources acquire the information by hacking or because they are whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and they leave the organization with the information. There are players outside of the mainstream media now in the West who are capable of acquiring huge amounts of digital information. I mean, we're not talking anymore about a man with a file of papers. We're talking about huge amounts of digital information in both of those cases, Assange and Snowden. And these present big challenges for the mainstream media about what they do and how they do it when one of those sources approaches a news organization.
We are almost towards the end of the show, but I want to ask you a question about internet and websites that publish information. You mentioned yesterday that internet is quite a paradox. It's a good invention, but then it causes some problems. And what is your comment on the information published on the internet?
Well, I think ultimately it's a good thing, and the position of the European Court of Rights is that it's a very important tool for freedom of speech and for the circulation of information and ideas in a democratic society, because we're no longer dependent on a small number of media organizations and publishers, very often wealthy people, wealthy organizations, to push those ideas and that information around society. We can do it ourselves, we can publish it ourselves, and we can choose what to read. And I think there are problems because you don't have professional journalists, skilled professional journalists, mediating the content that appears on the internet in the same way that you do with a big media organization. And you certainly don't have lawyers like me looking at it before it's published. But I think ultimately what will have to happen is that we as consumers of that information and content will have to become very, very discerning, very judgmental about what is good, what is bad, and what is somewhere in the middle. And we will have to make our judgments on the face of what is published. And it will make us better consumers of information and ideas, I think, than we have been up until now.
But that's based upon the standard of the society who reads this information on the internet.
It's based on that standard, but the more you read, the more you learn, the better you become at it. And the more people who have access to the internet and the capacity to learn from it, the better a society will be, I think.
You may have cases in UK as well, but in Albania, a big problem with the websites are especially the comments. There are some hate comments and rage towards the politicians or the public person that are mentioned in the article. How can we address that issue?
Look, nobody has a solution. Nobody has a perfect solution to this anywhere in the world at the moment. The best solution we have at the moment is to require all website providers, through law and regulation, to have what we call a notice and takedown procedure, which means if the subject of the offensive comment, of the defamatory comment, of the invasion of privacy, contacts the website provider or the internet service provider and draws their attention to what is being published about them and says, please take it down, they must take it down unless there's a good reason to keep it up there. That's the way it should work. And if they don't, then they should be liable to be sued as a publisher like anybody else. But it's an imperfect system. You can't police the internet. You can't come up with a global regulatory system because nobody will agree the same standards for it. So you have to do the best you can in the courts and through the regulatory system of your own country to impose discipline on website providers, to make sure that if a complaint comes in, they will respond to it properly.
And if they don't, you have to file in court for that.
You have to file in court, and they are as liable as anybody else to a claim in defamation, privacy, breach of confidence.
Thank you very much for your advices and for being here tonight, Mr.
Thank
Miller.
you.
Thank you very much. Të nderuar televizionistë, kemi përfunduar me një panoramë shumë interesante për sa i takon shpifjes, mënyrën se si duhet adresuar standardet e gazetarisë, gjykatat, vendimet që merren, arsyet që bën shpifja, interesi publik, interesi privat. Ju falenderoj shumë që na ndoqët. Natën e mirë.